Thank you guys for joining me for another episode of Keeping It Real with America's Supermom. I am excited about my next guest. We actually have not connected before this interview, so I have Leah here today, and I'm excited to hear about all the amazing things that she is doing with parents. So, before we get into a great conversation, I want to give her the opportunity to kind of introduce herself before we get into some great conversation.
Awesome. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm very excited about this because I do think we had some connection. There's definitely a reason we were brought together. So that is very exciting to me. My background started when I was a teenager. I was super into personal development. I was very fortunate to have that and have an amazing family that supported me. And I decided I wanted to do the same. And something that I am passionate about because of that was supporting youth. Because if you can give your kids, your teens, that boost a little bit younger, of course, they get to use it for longer. They get to use those skills in, understanding themselves and gaining that confidence. So I went through school. I focused on outdoor leadership to create experiential pieces, and I did social work as well. And with social work, I got more into that mental health and addictions realm for a while. I worked with a youth program that was based in the wilderness, and it was for youth who were overcoming substance abuse, who were overcoming mental health challenges. So as you can imagine, I'm sure for you especially, how challenging that would be as a family issue. And that was something we saw a lot of in that program, right? Often a lot of conflictual relationships, maybe a broken relationship that they hadn't talked in a long time. And one of the things we worked with, of course, with these youth and even with their families would come out to the program sometimes would be to help them increase that communication, help them increase empathy and understanding. And for this being an amazing program, the piece that moved me on from it partially was that I found it really sad that kids and their families and that whole group had to go so far down a pretty challenging path before they got that kind of support. And unfortunately, I think that's really how we treat mental health in our modern society. Is it's still mostly reactive, right? A kid's doing good in school, they kind of get a pat on the head, they go, good job. And then it's only when they're doing poorly, maybe, that they go see a counselor, and then the counselor gives them these skills, this ability to reflect and gain this perspective. And so I really want to work with people in a way that was a bit more proactive, that I think anyone at any level can still work to gain better skills in their communication, in their relationships, in a lot of different ways, in how they interact with other people. And so that's why I started All Thrive. And that's what I'm doing now, is helping people in that realm.
I love that. And I mean, that is music to my ears about being proactive, because my journey was dealing with depression and 3 hospitalizations. And now, currently, we have one of our daughters who's kind of going through that same thing. So I totally get what you're saying when it comes to the family. We have some of her younger siblings, we're talking them through it, but not understanding behaviors, and some of them can even be scared, but trying to keep the lines of communication open to where they can ask questions, find out a little bit more. So it's something that they can be curious about. And then they come up with their own ways of trying to connect with her during this challenging time. So I love that. Now, so this is the, dealing with people that are dealing with the mental illness. But when it comes to dealing with the youth, I love what you said about remembering to give them the tools earlier. What advice would you give some people who want to deal with the youth? Because I think we all have the good intention, desire, but then when it comes to actually connecting, it's like a foreign language. It's like talking at them instead of with them, and all these different things. So what kind of tips would you give someone, and even parents that are watching, for ways that they can actually connect with the youth?
Yeah, I wish there was a first of all, a really simple answer that was just like, well, say this one thing and it'll, ta-da, your relationship will be perfect. I think the first thing I like to talk about with parents, and is a really important point, is it can be really hard to go into something with parenting with such amazing intentions. Like, every parent, of course, wants to be a great parent, have a great relationship, and have to recognize that some of the things you are doing were not helping the relationship. And ultimately, because I do a lot of work with people about power dynamics, whether that's in a parent-child relationship, in a work relationship, but everyone goes in with these amazing intentions. And the part that often gets missed or overlooked is being able to take that beautiful gift of those great intentions, put it aside and say, hey, my intentions might have not had the impact I hoped for. And that's the first piece. And that's, parents, give yourself grace. You were dealing with whatever you were dealing with, doing the absolute best you could. But the problem is when we get stuck in those really good intentions, it often doesn't give us the space and the curiosity to explore what's actually happening with the youth. And, I'm not a mom myself yet, but working with teenagers who most people would consider, behaviorally challenged or troubled teens, all those kind of quotes that get put on top of them, you could still have so much space for curiosity. And you could still say, hey, as a youth worker, a social worker, I'm trying to help this kid. How am I making sure that what I'm doing is actually having a good impact? So that's the piece I like working with people with, is if you recognize you have great intentions and you recognize that something's not quite working, is how are you actively getting that feedback?
Yeah, that's great, because but I think one of the challenges with that as a parent is, you have this feeling like, okay, I didn't really do this right, but there's this problem with trying to admit it. It's like, I don't know what it is, but a lot of parents go through it where it is just this, like a scarlet letter on your chest, that you have made this mistake. So what advice would you give them to kind of get over that, so that they can begin? Because a lot of people just don't want to be transparent about their issues, and we want to cover them up and hide behind the mask and all this. I mean, I'm just speaking from my own story.
Totally.
But, how do you get people to trust to go ahead and shine the light on some of these dark spaces?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not going to lie and say once again that it's an easy journey necessarily. It is maybe looking at some darker spaces, some harder things, maybe not jumping in the deep end of the worst possible thing and starting with some small pieces. And maybe also thinking a little bit more about your long-term hopes. Because it can be really hard in the moment when you're thinking about a little bit of self-protection or trying to make sure this one thing happens. And, one of the saddest things that I think there is in terms of that parent-child relationship is, about half my friends, maybe I'd say, are people who after 18 went back and like to go see their parents for dinner and talk and communicate. And the other half really don't want anything to do with their parents. So when I think if people are looking at the long term, it's kind of thinking like, what do I think my current behavior is going to get me? And that, once again, might be a little bit of a harsh truth, and not thinking, if I don't do this right now, that's it, my relationship's done. It's not an instant thing, right? It's not one decision that's going to make or break a relationship. It's going to be that work you put in, and starting small, giving yourself that grace. And if you have especially a support person that you can talk to about this, obviously is going to be huge. Another mom, or your romantic partner, a sibling, a parent, whoever you can kind of go through this with. So I would say that's the first piece. Give yourself that grace, start small, but then do start looking at the long term. And one thing I found a lot of people have said is helpful is also think back to your relationships with people in power. That was probably your parents or guardians when you were growing up. It could even be bosses or teachers or those people, and think about what you would have liked from them to have a great relationship. And it's putting yourself back in that position really, and saying, okay, well, you know what? I knew when my parents screwed up, and how often in those points did you get maybe a genuine apology or someone saying, hey, I know I didn't do that perfect. I know teens especially can maybe be a bit cruel, so you have to be careful how you approach this depending on your relationship. But being able to say like, man, what would I have wanted when those kinds of things happened? And what would have that done for my relationships going forward? Would I still have had a more relationship with this person? So it's unfortunately a little bit of big picture thinking. It's that piece of reflecting and looking at some of these different components that have come together in your life and how you want them to move forward with your kids.
I love that. And, what are some ways that we can have the conversation with the youth? I think that's one of the things, is it's hard because, if you're a person of power, or, you're dealing with a troubled youth, and you are striving for them to be, good and have good behavior, trying to bridge that gap to just kind of open communication, that can be a hard barrier to overcome. So what are some ways that we should talk to them? How do we open up that conversation?
Totally. Yeah, it can be challenging, especially if these are new skills that you haven't
Mhm.
tried before.
Mhm.
I'll give the example again, the youth coming into camp. Often we're not much of one for maybe having great communication with their parents, and their parents,
Mhm.
same thing, really had a challenge. And if you're thinking about that, trying to do your best and protect, these parents might have seen their kids and worried about them living or dying because of the
Right.
choices they were making, right? Like there was a lot of that felt sense. And one of my favorite examples that we had is we'd have the families of our youth come out for a weekend at the program. That was the
Mhm.
ideal. And throughout that weekend, we do a lot of stuff, and especially working on communication for
Mhm.
obvious reasons. And we worked on this type of communication called nonviolent communication, which I highly recommend to everyone. Marshall Rosenberg, you can look it up online. There's a ton of resources, and
Mhm.
it's really all about empathy. And this is where I'd come to
Mhm.
for everything: building empathy between people, true understanding about why what we're saying is important, how what it means to us on a deeper level. So we spend the whole weekend working with this family, working with these families, practicing, practicing, practicing. And at the end of the weekend, one of the dads, like in the last half hour, we're trying to wrap up, and he goes, "Well, this was great. I really love it, but how can I use this to control my kid?" And we're all sitting there like, "Oh
Mhm.
my God, he missed the point, the entire
Right.
point of this weekend." What we were thinking, it was really lovely because another dad actually turned to him and said, you didn't get it, because it's creating empathy with your kid actually is going to create that behavior change, is going to make them want to
Mhm.
talk to you. Like if they feel truly
Mhm.
understood by you and they feel like they can truly understand you, they're going to want to be more in alignment. It's when we try to, cinch in our control, like I've got to make sure my kid's safe, I've got to do this, we get
Mhm.
tighter and tighter, and they, of course, they're going to push back, right? They have no option. At some
Mhm.
point they're going to go, "God, stop it, I need my space," or "I'm trying to grow," or
Mhm.
whatever that looks like. And this other father was just saying, "I got more from my kid this weekend and understood more about her than I have in
Mhm.
ages. Like I feel
Mhm.
we're on a totally different page now in the way that we're
Mhm.
interacting." And that was one of our most powerful moments. Yeah, you need to build this empathy. And if you can let go of that piece of control and try to create this sense of understanding instead, once again, can be very challenging, but
Mhm.
just so, so rewarding.
I love that because, so often it's to me, I call it getting rid of the judgment. If
Totally.
we have the mindset of understanding, hey, I'm in this space now dealing with my boss, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it could be something totally unrelated, but when you have empathy, you're able to transfer that lesson or whatever in something that's applicable to what you're doing yourself, which can help you to come up with some ways that you can talk through that issue. So I love
Definitely.
that you mentioned it.
When
Yeah.
I think when you start looking at things like that from that really empathetic space, you realize no one is making stupid decisions, right? Even the decision
Mm,
to use drugs, you have to look at as a solution, right? They're trying to figure out to deal with some way in their life. And when you start saying there was a reason that someone did this, it is, like you said, a lot harder to judge them. It's a lot harder to be like,
mhm,
well, my kid is just trying to be a bad kid,
mm,
right? Oh, my
mhm,
kid's just rebelling for no reason. You're starting to say, oh, they were really caring about this thing. You could tell they were really
mhm,
valuing, or this was so important to them that they did something that I didn't like, right? That they
mhm,
chose an action that I see as bad, but recognizing they were really doing it because it was important to them. I
mhm.
think that helps a lot too, because then you do get to have a different conversation about it versus one person being bad, one person being good, and the ensuing conflict that happens from that.
Mhm. Now, so how do we kinda separate ourselves from the outcome? That's one of the things that's kinda happened for me in terms of recognizing that, "Hey, I'm gonna do X, and I would hope that it worked out this way," but, just having that composure and that space to allow people to respond in a way that they would like to and not being married to the outcome. So, how do you get to that point for some people?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. One of the pieces would be, before you decide to go into whatever discussion this is, because generally people are going to have an idea. When you said that, I suspect a couple
Mhm.
people went, "Oh yeah, I have a situation in my head already of what this is." One of the things I would consider is start considering what acceptable bad results are, to be quite honest, right? So let's say you're giving the example of trusting your teenager with a new step. Maybe their curfew goes a little bit later, or they're allowed to go out in a different way, maybe their first date, whatever that looks like, is what are the acceptable bad things that could happen? And then what are the unacceptable bad things that could happen? And once again, I would actually bring that into a discussion, because teenagers aren't stupid. They have pretty good BS detectors, let's say. They know that you're worried about these things. Most teenagers recognize, hey, mom and dad want to let go of those reins a little bit. They're going to let me have a little bit of freedom. And being able to speak to them and say, hey, like, this is what we want to give you, this chance to like make your mistakes. This is the big thing we're worried about. And how do we work with staying away from that one result? Or as a parent, just in general, what is my acceptable risk? If your kid says they want to take up, I don't know, swimming in shark infested waters, holding some stakes, you might have a conversation like, this is too far out of my comfort level. But when they're saying, yeah, you know what, I want to try this new thing, I want to go here, what realistically is the risk, and can you live with that? So although once again, it's very gray. There should be no black and white answers in this realm, unfortunately, and black and white is very comforting.
Well, so, I mean, I like that, because at least, you kind of have, I think it's the thing about self-governing. You have certain boundaries. And when you resolve that with yourself, then you're comfortable admitting those. And then you can have the conversation if someone feels differently and explore it where it's not a personal attack. So if you're like, hey, you know what, things are crazy, you need to be home at a decent hour just because of what's going on in the world or whatever, that's understandable. So if they come against that boundary, then you can discuss it more as a conversation rather than you're just trying to be rebellious or whatever we may be thinking as parents.
Totally.
Or with any relationship, really.
Yeah. And I love that piece too that you're talking about boundaries, because that is such a foundationally important piece of relationship, of any relationship. And a conversation that's sometimes interesting to have with teenagers too is, do they know their own boundaries? Right? So a lot of teens might surprise their parents in what they have as boundaries. Like, oh, well, and same thing. If you're at that point where you can have these discussions, obviously depending on where your relationship is, your communication styles, but you might realize that your kid already has some boundaries as well. And then that discussion is, hey, I have some boundaries, you have some boundaries, trying to respect both, and recognizing too, teenagers, frontal lobe not fully developed, might not have great boundaries, might not have good pre-thinking or in the moment those regulation skills. And there are points too as a parent to come in. I'm certainly not advocating like just let your kids go do things and run free, but as a parent, there are times when you do want to use that power dynamic and use it to support healthy boundaries, teaching them healthy boundaries, and practicing that, versus you can also go too far the other way. And I guess I just want to make sure that I clarified that this shouldn't just be listen to your kids, empathize with them, and let them do what they want. Listen to their kids, empathize with them, help them practice empathizing with you and why your boundaries are important and why your experience is important, and then move forward together.
I love that. Now, and I love that piece about having that discussion about it, because, oftentimes we, forget that, our kids, the boundary may be something that we don't approve of, but, it still could be a boundary, and having a conversation around that. So I think that's great. Now, for people who are dealing with troubled youth and dealing with some of their decisions, how do you kind of navigate through that piece of educating them about the boundary and, without taking it so personal about trying to control them transforming their behavior? Kids are going to make wrong decisions. They may hang out with somebody that you think is questionable, or they don't come in at curfew. How do you work through some of those violations in a way that still builds the relationship?
Yeah. I mean, I am, first of all, a big proponent of healthy conflict being a good thing in relationship.
Mhm.
because it can actually move the relationship forward. It can help you understand each other better when you're able to talk about it in this healthy, regulated way.
Mhm.
Um, I think a really useful conversation in this, because there's a lot of different ways you could approach this,
Mhm.
but a really useful conversation is really talking about the benefits that they get from different behaviors. And so
Mm.
when you do think about, maybe that friend that you're worried about, you're like, oh, is this going to lead my kid down a path I'm worried about? You have to recognize that your kid is getting a benefit from their friendship with that person. And
Mm.
so I think often where we go wrong is when we ask people to change behavior, we ask them to stop something. And so
Mm.
you say, okay, stop hanging out with Timmy, he's bad news. And meanwhile, what your kid was doing when they were reaching out for that relationship, they had probably a sense of belonging with Timmy. Maybe Timmy helped their social status at school and they were feeling less picked on by other kids because Timmy was cool and, had that kind of vibe. Maybe just they felt like Timmy heard and understood them in a different way. So when you start saying things like, stop this behavior, you take away their ability to have all these positive outcomes that they see, because they might not be seeing the
Mm.
negative outcomes, right? You might be seeing the negative outcomes, but they might not. And we
Mm.
all have these kind of behaviors. I have bad habits. I recognize there's reasons I do them. If I don't address those reasons, then if I tried to stop the habit, it's not going to do anything, because I still want to get those needs met. I still
Mm.
need my need for belonging. I still have that requirement for that kind of connection or feeling heard. So when we start having these discussions, it's helping your kids identify what are they getting from this kind of thing, and
Mm.
are there other ways they could get it? Because if there are legitimate concerns about maybe something that Timmy's been encouraging your kid to do, okay, so we still want to make sure you have that friendship, that connection. Where else could we find that? Is there a different
Mm.
activity? Is there someone else that might be a really good balance for this? Because you can't just get rid of something. You have to replace it with something.
I love that. And that is so key because, that's like somebody who wants to lose weight and they're talking about all the things they need to eliminate. Well, what are you going to add? Because you can't just take away and not replace it because you're going to be back where you started really quick. So
Totally.
I
Or
love that. And I love the part about, really exploring. I think that's a great, healthy conversation, seeking to understand what it is that they're beneficially getting from this relationship and helping them to determine what they can get and how they can do it differently. So I think that is awesome. Yeah,
yeah,
that's
and it's
great. Great
it's
advice.
it's absolutely every level. I mean, same thing talking with kids about drug use. They
Mm-hmm.
are using those drugs for a reason. No kid doesn't know, no kid hasn't been told drugs are bad. It's
Mm-hmm.
a pretty consistent message, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've been told about all the dangers and all the bad things that could happen, and there's something more important to them that they're getting from that in that moment than all of those things that they've heard. And
Mm-hmm.
every single behavior, the gang behavior, violence, all of it comes from this place of they're trying to figure something out. So
Mhm. I
yeah,
love that. That's great. Now, I guess that this will be my last question. I can go on
yeah.
forever. I have like 10 kids that still live at home. So I'm like, hey, this is some stuff I can learn from myself. And then I was an only child. Um, but when it comes to thinking about people that are troubled youth, what are some of the precursors that kind of get them on that road? Some things that maybe, as we talk in the beginning about being proactive, that we can kind of be mindful of so that we just don't have to have that rock bottom or that downward spiral that many people encounter.
Yeah. I mean, it's tough because I'm not going to say there's one thing that could definitely solve every problem, and there's a
Mhm.
lot of other factors that might come into play, like trauma. And trauma is a big
Mhm.
one that can affect a lot of people and take behaviors that in other people might not be quite as challenging, and take them to a bigger
Mhm.
level because they're trying to work through something they just can't do on their own. So that kind of support is definitely huge. But if I was to say one factor overall, it would be, how is this young person feeling belonging? And belonging can
Mm.
be from a variety of sources. So with your kids, I'm guessing that you've put in a fair bit of attention and work to make healthy relationships, that
Mhm.
they have at the very least a sense of home and family and belonging with you.
Mm.
Kids also need belonging with people of their own generation, roughly their own
Mhm.
age. And so how are they getting healthy relationships that help them feel supported and cared for and loved? Because so many challenging youth behaviors, like I hate to say troubled youth, right? That it
Mm-hmm.
implies a lot, but so many behaviors that we really worry about are from people who are seeking connection with a community of people that use drugs and say, hey, you're welcome to come with us because we accept everyone, right? That's a
Mm-hmm.
powerful message for a teen. Or gangs are a really big sense of community, right? You're one of us
Mm-hmm.
forever, would die for you, you're part of the
Mm-hmm.
family.
Mm-hmm.
Those are obviously on the extreme end of behaviors, but all of the parts in between too are I'd say so many of them are from people who don't feel like they fit in, like they don't belong, like they don't have even that one person that cares for them, you know, no matter what they do, that'll always be there. So if I could put out one thing, it would be try to just help them build those really strong, healthy relationships and be there for them, even if they do and when they do make poor decisions.
Yeah, I think that's great. That I love that. And we hear that a lot about, wanting to be seen and heard,
Yeah, it's
and
huge.
part of a community and feeling like you belong. So I think that is great. And sometimes as parents, we forget about that. You think, well, hey, it's community. I'm taking care of you. Okay. You need something, I'm getting it for you. But it just changes as the child grows up. They have different needs and it's an evolution. So being present with that, I think, is very important. So I love that you said that.
Thank
So,
you.
what is the best way for the audience to get a hold of you?
Well, so from what I understand, we will put some contact info somewhere with this. You
Mm-hmm.
could check out allthrive.ca, which is my website. But I would also encourage people, if you have questions about what I talked about, or you have a specific example and you want to do just a quick little, I always offer a free little virtual coffee consult, and I'll make sure to give you that link as well. So feel free to hit me up and we can chat a bit, and hopefully I'll be able to give you some suggestions.
Awesome. And so, what final words would you like to leave with the audience today? This has been a great conversation. So, what are your takeaways? Something that you want to share?
Well, thank you. First of all, I've certainly enjoyed it, and I love being able to share this.
Mm-hmm.
As much as in every relationship in your life, but especially with your kids, as much as you can in the hard points still work to feel that empathy and think, why are they doing this? And as much as you can, if they're older and you have that relationship, ask them, like really, really train them to tell you why this is important to them and hear that piece. That is just such a strong factor in creating really strong relationships and really great mental health resilience. So that would be my one overall point.
I love that. I mean, and that's something, like I said, we can apply that to all ages and,
Yeah.
all relationships, not just with our children. So that is some great words of wisdom. Well,
Thank you.
thank you so much, Leah. I'm so glad that we got connected. It's so funny. We were before filming, we're like, how do we meet each other? But, this has been a great conversation. So I am so excited that we got connected. And, love all the tips and insights that you share because I think it's important to make sure that we do connect with our youth. And I just really want to thank you for your service. It takes a special person to deal with youth. And even when you don't have kids of your own, it's, a special place to be able to do that. So I just want to thank you for your service with that as well.
Well, thank you. I've really appreciated being here and the chance to share with you.
Absolutely. And you're welcome back anytime. Youth is one of the things, hey, I got to stay on top of what they're doing. I have a 7-year-old, and then our oldest is 31, and every age in between. So I am always admitting I don't know everything. So always welcome to hear some insights when it comes to that. So I appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you. And I applaud you very much for that, because that is the mindset you need, is always go in asking, questioning, trying to figure out more. Because if you think you're the perfect parent, I can guarantee you're probably the opposite, unfortunately,
You're
right?
going to fall flat on your face real quick. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they'll tell you about yourself, okay? So they don't have a problem holding their tongue about anything. So yeah,
Nope.
definitely. Well, this has been wonderful. We want to thank you guys so much for joining us today.
Mhm.
If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments. We'll be sure that Leah gets those from you. And in the meantime, just take heed. Just do one thing. You can't do it all, but maybe one thing that can help you rebuild your relationship with your youth or just anyone that you may have a relationship. It may not be with them, it could be coworkers or family members. So, we want to thank you guys so much for joining us today. And we will see you all on the next episode. Bye for now.